Hello everyone and welcome to the VCAP for Landscape Professionals webinar part 2. We're going to be getting into some of the technical and design criteria. My name is Dan Schwartz. I'm a soil scientist with the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District, so I will be presenting about soil. In many cases, you have to know what soil type you have before you can design a proper VCAP practice. In particular, any practice that tries to get water back into the ground, things like rain gardens, bioretention, dry well, infiltration trenches, and porous paving, really need suitable soil. The soil has to be fairly porous, it has to be able to accept water and let it pass through fairly quickly. And if you don't have these things, then these practices are not well suited for your site. Just a quick note, rain gardens and bioretention are basically the same thing. The difference between the two is scale. Rain gardens are significantly smaller. They're designed to capture the runoff from one or two residential downspouts, from a backyard, from a front yard. Bioretentions are basically very large, more engineered rain gardens that are designed to accept a much larger volume of water from a much larger drainage area. Same thing with dry wells and infiltration trenches. They're basically the same thing, it's just dry wells are fairly small, infiltration trenches are significantly larger. But all of these practices have to have good soil in order to function properly. The problem that we find in this area is that many of our soils are not particularly well suited, and there's a variety of reasons for this. One of the most common is density. In urban areas, all urban areas, not just ours, we generally tend to have a lot of dense, compacted soil because that soil has been graded. It's been run over by heavy machineries. It's been packed back down. And what results is a very dense material that will allow some water to pass through, but generally at a much slower rate than the natural soil that was there before development. We also have areas of particularly high clay content. Those areas are shown in orange on the map. And that's not to say that these are the only areas where you'll find a lot of clay, but these areas are particularly well known for having high clay content. Clay is also a very somewhat dense material that does not allow water to pass through very quickly. Certain areas have very shallow bedrock, meaning you don't have to dig down very far from the surface in order to hit that rock. This can be a real problem if you want to build a rain garden or a dry well, because you need a certain distance of soil that the water will pass through in order to be properly filtered. And if you have bedrock within a couple feet of the surface, you won't get that necessary distance. I'm highlighting the western part of Fairfax County because that is an area that's particularly well known for having shallow bedrock. In many cases out in Centerville, Herndon, Dulles, Chantilly area, you only have to dig down anywhere from 1 to 5 feet in order to hit bedrock. But again, that's not to say that this is the only area where you will find shallow rock, but it is an area well known for that problem. We also have high groundwater. In the southeastern areas of the county, in basically all of the city of Alexandria and in a good portion of Arlington, you will find wide swaths of area that have shallow groundwater. You only have to dig down a couple feet in order to see saturation. And again, because you need the water, the surface runoff, to percolate through several feet of good dry soil first, that makes these wet, high groundwater soils not particularly well suited for rain gardens, dry wells, porous paving. You also have areas of flooding. These would be areas around our major streams, within the floodplains next to those streams. After every heavy rain, you might have surface water rushing over the surface in large volume at a high speed, and obviously this is a really bad spot to put a rain garden or a dry well. And again, with all of these things that I'm showing up on the map, I'm showing some specific areas where you are very likely to find these problems, but that's not to say that these are the only areas where you'll find problems with density, clay, shallow rock, high groundwater, or flooding. And it's also not to say that you can't find a suitable area within the city of Alexandria, for instance, for a rain garden. Maybe you will find that dry soil. So this is a very general map. There, of course, are going to be exceptions to this map, both in the positive direction and in the negative direction. But generally, this gives you an idea of some of the problem areas that we have within Northern Virginia. And this should also give the idea that A rain garden, a dry well, a bioretention, an infiltration trench really has to be sited correctly in order to work. And there's a lot of limitations out there that will make a site not particularly well suited for any one of those practices.
So what do you do if you have a client that comes to you and is interested in an infiltration project, like let's say a rain garden? Well, you really do have to examine the site to determine if a rain garden would really work for them. And there's 3 steps to this examination. Step 1 is to use the soil maps to figure out what soil types are mapped on their property and whether those soil types are indeed suitable for that rain garden. Step 2 is to observe the site. So head out to the site, look around, look at the topography, look at where water is flowing, where it's pooling, and that'll help you narrow down potentially good areas on the property for that rain garden. And then finally, there's step 3, field verification. Once you've narrowed down those potentially good areas through observation, you need to start digging. Pull out the shovel, pull out the auger, pull out the post hole digger, and actually take a look at the soil in the field to see if it truly is suitable for that rain garden. You'll notice I put a big asterisk next to the title of the slide. And that's because in many, if not most cases with the VCAP applicants, these 3 steps will be done for you before you even get on the scene. Because when a new VCAP applicant first starts out in the VCAP application process, the first thing that they submit to our office is a site visit request. And in that site visit request, they will say what kind of projects they're interested in. We will then look up the soil maps, the soil type on their property to determine if the soils that are mapped there are indeed suitable for the projects that they have an interest in. And let's say they are interested in something like a rain garden or one of the other infiltration projects. If we find that the soil types mapped on their property are not suitable for that type of project, that will trigger an investigation by us where we will go out, observe the site, and also set up the basic soil test, the field verification in step 3, where we'll dig around and take a look at the soil, run some basic tests to determine if indeed that soil could work for the rain garden, the dry well, the infiltration trench that client is interested in. So in most cases, these 3 steps will be done before you get on the scene, but there could be some exceptions to that. Let's say you're working with an existing client, and in fact, you were the one who suggests that they apply for the VCAP program. Obviously, you will be there before us, and it may be necessary for you to do some or all of these 3 steps. Additionally, if someone sets up or sends in a site visit request to us saying that they're interested in a rain garden, we look up their soil types in step 1, and indeed their soil types do look quite suitable for that rain garden. That will not trigger an alarm for us, so oftentimes we will not set up the field verification. We won't run the soils tests if the soil maps tell us that they have a suitable soil on site. And in cases like that, it may fall to you to run some of these tests. So step 1, using the soil maps. How do you find the soils maps, and how do you search through them in order to find the soil types that are mapped on your client's property and determine if those soil types are indeed suitable for that rain garden? Well, for Fairfax County, you can use the Soils Viewer, which is an interactive map that shows the soils map and allows you to look up ratings for all of the soils all in one place. You can find that, you can find a link to the Soils Viewer on the VCAP program page, which is at www.fairfaxcounty.gov/soil-water-conservation-assistance-programs. I know that's a long URL, but it's a great web page to memorize because, again, not only does it have a link to the Soils Viewer, it has a lot of other useful VCAP information that'll be of value to you as you prepare projects for your VCAP clients. If you're working in one of the other jurisdictions for which we also oversee the VCAP program, this would be the City of Fairfax and the City of Alexandria, you would use the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Web Soil Survey to look up soils information for those 2 jurisdictions. And the URL there is websoilsurvey.nrcs.usda.gov. This is a national website, so if you happen to be working in some other jurisdiction altogether, chances are the soil survey, the soil map for that jurisdiction will be up on the USDA's Web Soil Survey. The Web Soil Survey does include a soils map for Fairfax County, but that soils map is slightly different than the one that you'll find on the Soils Viewer. So I would really recommend you use the Soils Viewer when looking up soil types in Fairfax County. If you click on the URL for the VCAP program page, this is where you will land. And what you want to do is scroll down a little bit to the helpful resources list towards the bottom of the page. This is where you'll find, amongst the many resources listed, the link to the Fairfax County GIS mapping resources right here. We'll click on this, and this will bring up a whole variety of maps that you can use and interact with, but of course the one we're interested in is the Soils Viewer. All these are listed alphabetically, so we simply need to scroll down to the S's. Here we are, there's the Soils Viewer. Click on that. It'll pull the app up. Here's our landing page, which tells you a little bit about it. We'll click OK and get out of there. Basically, what you want to do at this point is type in the address for your client in the top left here. I'm going to use as an example the Government Center complex. 12,000 Government Center Parkway. You can hit the little magnifying lens here or find the address in the drop-down menu, and it'll zoom right into there. And here we are at the Government Center. What you'll see on this map as I scroll around, all the red lines, the thick red lines, those are the various soil types. So those red lines are actually the boundaries of the various soil types. Let me close out of this, minimize that. So you see we got soil type 102 right here. We got soil type 39C. We got soil type 93B. So next what you want to do is zoom to the area that you are proposing as the site for that rain garden. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, that we were going to put a rain garden just below the driveway here. So right about there. When you click on the map, it'll bring up a series of little data tabs. Some of these will be the soils data that you are looking for. Some of them will not be. In this case, it brought up the general parcel report first. I'm not interested in that, but you can see this is 1 out of 4 pages of data tabs. So all you have to do then is just click this little arrow at the top, which will take you to the next. Here's our soils information. So if you don't see the soils information immediately, just click on one of those arrows at the top of the tab, and it'll eventually take you to the soils page. So this is telling us that the soil type is 30A. That's the alphanumeric legend code. It doesn't tell us much. But how you figure out what that soil type is then you click on the More Info button, the Description and Interpretive Guide to Soils. This will take you to a PDF that has a description of all the soil types mapped in Fairfax County, including soil type 30A. It'll have ratings tables, suitability tables, as well as just a little paragraph description of each of the soil types. And we will click on that in a second, but the first thing I wanted to show you was the soil property rating down here. We can click on the little arrow next to it, and it'll give us the soil's name. So soil type 30A in Common English is Codorus and Hatboro soils. Still doesn't tell us all that much, so we still have to click one more time, and it'll bring up a little bit of a data table. So again, the soil name, Codorus and Hatboro. The soil number is 30, as we saw. It tells you such things as the problem class, the soil's hydrologic group, the surface K erosion factor, things that probably are not that of much use or interest to you. But if you scroll down, you will find some interesting stuff. Here's a general subsoil permeability rate range. So water will percolate through the soil at a general range of 0.6 to 2 inches per hour. That might be useful if you were looking at a rain garden, but this is a very general range. Here's where it really gets interesting though. We've got the depth to water table in feet, 0 to 2 feet. This means that you can expect to find groundwater from the surface to 2 feet below the surface. This is the seasonal high water table, so it's the highest that groundwater comes throughout the season. But still, you probably don't want to put a rain garden into a soil that has groundwater within 2 feet of the soil surface, even if it's only for part of the year. Depth of hard bedrock is 8 to 20 feet. That's not bad. That's fine for a rain garden. You're not going to be putting in an 8-foot or 15-foot rain garden. The soil drainage, though, is poor. The suitability for septic drain fields is poor. The suitability for infiltration facilities, all listed as poor. These don't give you a lot of detail. They're qualitative ratings, but I think they're very important. Obviously, suitability for infiltration facilities is the most important if you're designing a rain garden. But what makes an infiltration facility work also makes a septic drain field work, also is good for soil drainage. So if soil drainage, suitability for septic, and suitability for infiltration projects are all listed as poor, that's a lot of red flags right there. So that's telling you quite a bit. Let's go back and go to this other link, the Description and Interpretive Guide to Soils. Now, a lot of what we find here will be repeats of what we just saw in that little data table that we pulled up on our data tab. But here you can get that information and a bit more. So this will take you to a pretty long PDF, which again is called the Description and Interpretive Guide to Soils in Fairfax County. The first couple pages will tell you a little bit about the soil maps, the soil survey, how they were made, the general geology of Fairfax County, the physiographic provinces, which are different areas of unique geology. And then you get to this big data table, which shows all of the soil types mapped in Fairfax County. If you remember, the one we were looking at was soil type 30, Codorus and Hatboro soils. All of this data right here is the same as what was pulled up on that data tab. So for instance, depth to the water table, 0 to 2 feet. Soil drainage, poor. Suitability for septic drain fields, poor. Suitability for infiltration trenches, poor. Same stuff. Here it's just showing it in the full data tab format. If you scroll down from there, what you'll also find is a section of this guide which goes through and provides a short paragraph explanation of each of these soil types. So I'm going to scroll down to soil type 30. Here we are, Codorus and Hatboro soils. Here's just in plain English, or as plain as we can make it, what this soil is about. This channel dissected soil grouping occurs in floodplains and drainage ways of the Piedmont and coastal plain and is susceptible to flooding. Soil material is mainly silty and loamy, but stratified layers of sand and gravels are not uncommon. The seasonal high water table varies between 0 and 2 feet below the surface. Depth of hard bedrock ranges from 6 to 30 feet below the surface. Permeability is variable. Foundation support is poor because of soft soil, seasonal saturation, and flooding. Septic drain fields and infiltration trenches are poorly suited because of wetness and flooding potential. And there's some other stuff here, and the last sentence might be useful too. Hydric soils, which may include non-tidal wetlands, occur within this mapping unit. So basically, if you're thinking of putting a rain garden here, what you are saying is you're thinking of putting a rain garden in a floodplain soil that may have tidal wetlands, a water table between 0 and 2 feet below the surface, and variable permeability, and it's susceptible to flooding. This is not a suitable soil for a rain garden. And if you were looking through the soil maps before going out to see your client, you could pretty much say that this site is sort of there's so many red flags raised by this Codorus and Hatboro soil that you really wouldn't want to put a rain garden, an infiltration trench, a dry well anywhere close to here. So this is kind of an extreme example, but it does show you what the soil maps can tell you about the soil before you even make it out to the client's property. As you're working your way through the soils viewer, one other thing to note is that in addition to the basic layers that are automatically loaded when you open the soil survey, you can put more layers on right here. So if you click this button, this is the layers list. Kind of looks like a sandwich stacked on top of each other. And here you can see we've got the official 2018 soils maps pulled up, but we do have some of the older ones as well, historic soils maps. So if you wanted to see what was mapped in 2011 or 1990, you can. And then there's some other subsets of the soil map which might be useful to you. So if you wanted to see areas that used to be mapped as marine clay, these are sort of areas that have a really sticky, shrinking, swelling type of soil. You can turn that on. Other areas that have shrinking, swelling, sticky clays but are not marine clay, we've got a layer for that. Then we've got Marumsco soils, which are basically the current name of marine clay. So see where marine clay is currently mapped, click on the Marumsco soils. There's an area of the county where there's some potential natural asbestos in the bedrock. You can click on that to see where that would be located. All things that would be useful to know before you start digging. It looks like none of those layers are pulling up right here. So obviously none of those types of soil are mapped on the government center property, but they are mapped in other parts of Fairfax County. So that in a nutshell is how to use the soils viewer, and I hope it's fairly easy and fairly intuitive.
Now that you have the basic soils information, you can proceed to step 2, which is to make observations of the site. While on site, one thing I always look for is the presence of standing water. And in fact, this is often a spot where clients want to put a rain garden or a dry well or an infiltration trench. And intuitively, it kind of makes sense. Where the soil is wet, you would think, oh, I want to put down an infiltration trench, which will help dry the soil out. But actually, areas of standing water are often the worst spots for an infiltration practice because that standing water is standing there for a reason. Maybe the soil is very compacted in that area and just not porous enough to allow storm water to quickly pass through. Maybe it's at a low spot on the yard and perhaps you have a little bit of groundwater that's coming to the surface. So oftentimes when you see standing water, that really is not a good place to put a rain garden or a dry well. So take a look at the standing water, ask the client, ask yourself, how long does it stand there? Is the grass stained? Is the vegetation dead? Which are both signs of prolonged saturation. And generally speaking, areas with long-standing water are generally poorly suited for a rain garden, a dry well, or another infiltration practice. The fact that the water is pooling there is telling you that that soil probably is just not porous enough to successfully host one of those sites. So rather, can you find something upstream of that soggy area where the water can be captured instead? Let's say you have a soggy spot and you look upstream and there's a couple downspouts letting out just at the top of the hill. So obviously those downspouts are contributing a lot of the flow volume that's going down to that low spot and standing there in that soggy puddle. So instead of putting a rain garden in the soggy area down at the bottom of the hill, perhaps you could put it on the slope leading from the house down to that soggy area, intercept that water before it gets to the puddle. So these are some of the things that you can look for when you are examining the site. Next, you move on to step 3, field verification. This is where you pull out your tools and you actually start digging and looking at the soil. These tools could include something like an auger, which is what I usually use, but some more common tools that you may have in your possession already are post hole diggers or, of course, just shovels. What you ideally want to do is dig as close as is practical to the bottom of the proposed rain garden, infiltration trench, dry well, whatever, or perhaps even a little bit deeper if you can. Sometimes this can be very difficult, especially if you're looking at a 4 or 5 foot deep rain garden. As you're digging, you want to look for the presence of bedrock, the presence of water table, or other obstructions that may interfere with the proper functioning of a dry well rain garden infiltration practice. The picture I'm showing there is a picture of a really, really wet soil. What can be quite confusing about wet soils is they're not necessarily wet throughout the year. Oftentimes you'll find that soils are very wet in spring, and then during the summer and early fall they dry out. But you want to know where the water table gets to at its highest point, and you can often guess as to where that seasonal high water table is based upon the colors of the soil. If you're seeing a soil that looks like the soil on this slide, that's bad news. You see all those big gray splotches mixed in with bright oranges and reds. Gray splotches mixed with oranges and reds is a sure sign of a soil that is saturated for a good portion of the year. So even if you dig up a soil that looks like this, and the day that you're looking at it, it's bone dry, what the colors of this soil are telling you is that during a good portion of the year, perhaps even up to 4 or 5 months worth, that soil is underwater. That depth of soil is saturated. This can be a fairly tricky thing to do if you haven't done soil analysis before, but you're basically looking for those gray splotches mixed in with oranges and yellows. The grayer the soil gets, the wetter it is for a longer period of time. You have to be practical with this analysis as well too. Your client probably doesn't want you to dig a 5-foot hole in their front yard with a shovel just to see how good the soil is. So dig as deep as your client will allow, as deep as your time will allow as well too. The other option is you can also call me to set up the soils test. And in many cases, this soil analysis is done earlier on in the VCAP application process before the client even starts looking for a contractor. Generally speaking, our staff here at the Conservation District are the first people to go out to the client's property. If they're thinking about a rain garden and they have soils that look like they might be marginal based upon what we're seeing on site or through the soils maps, a lot of times I will do these tests beforehand. So you'll have this data, your client will have this data, and you won't have to do it. But every now and then you may be called upon to do this analysis yourself.
Next, we move on to part 2 of the field verification, which is the infiltration test. An infiltration test is a simple test that determines the ability of the soil to absorb water. Conducting an infiltration test is mandatory for any of the infiltration projects that the Conservation Assistance Program can fund. These projects include rain gardens, permeable pavements, dry wells, infiltration trenches, and bioretention facilities. Basically, if the project temporarily stores stormwater and soaks it into the ground, you have to conduct an infiltration test first, which will determine if the site is really suitable for this type of project. An infiltration test is quite simple, but it's time consuming. You dig a hole, you fill up the hole with water, and then every hour you measure how quickly that water drops. The depth of the test is determined by what type of practice you're hoping to install. For shallower practices like rain gardens, permeable pavements, the test hole only has to be 12 to 18 inches deep. For deeper practices like dry wells, infiltration trenches, and bioretention facilities, the test hole should be 24 to 36 inches deep. Generally speaking, it's the homeowner or the property owner that conducts the test, meaning observes the water, takes the measurements, because we do want to see test data over a 5-hour span. And generally speaking, contractors just don't have that time to spend at their client's property. What we do see, though, is sometimes a contractor will help their client prep the test, meaning dig the hole, especially for some of these deeper tests, like for the dry well or for the infiltration trench. Some homeowners are not capable of digging a 24 or 36 inch deep hole, so they may rely on their contractor to do that work for them. Once the hole is dug, filled with water, the homeowner or property owner will then take the measurements, take the actual infiltration readings. We will provide them with a data sheet that they can fill out. The first thing that they want to fill out is the depth of their hole. In this case, assuming they're probably putting in a rain garden or permeable pavement, because the hole is only 18 inches deep. Moving over to the first column, data column of this table, time. In the time column, the homeowner would put down the time that the infiltration measurement was taken. And what is the infiltration measurement? It's basically the distance from the top of the hole to the surface of the water. So the next column is that actual measurement. What is that distance from the top of the hole to the surface of the water? In this example, the homeowner took their first reading at 12:30 in the afternoon, and at that time, the water was sitting 4 inches from the top of the hole. The next reading they took was at 1:30. The water was 6¼ inches from the top of the hole. An hour later at 2:30, the water was 7½ inches. An hour later, 8½ inches from the top of the hole. An hour later, 9¼ inches, and finally down at the final hour of the test, it was 10 inches from the top of the hole. This is the data that the homeowner, property owner will collect. They will send that raw data to us, and the last 2 columns of the test we will calculate ourselves. It's very simple measurements, very simple math, but for quality control and consistency purposes, we do like the homeowner to send their raw data to us so we can do these simple measurements to determine both the drop from hour to hour, the drop in the water depth from hour to hour, and then finally the infiltration rate, which is taken as inches per hour. The drop is quite simple. You just take the measurement from 1 hour to the next and find out the difference between them. So for instance, from hour 0 to hour 1, the water dropped from 4 inches below the top of the hole to 6¼ inches below the top of the hole. That accounts for a drop of 2¼ inches. As the test progressed, the drop lessened from hour to hour. So we went from 2¼ hours in the first hour of the test to 1¼ hours in the second hour, to 1 inch drop in the next hour, to 3/4 inch drop in hours 4 and 5, the last two measurements of the test. The last column is the infiltration rate. We calculate this by taking the drop divided by the time increment. This is a very simple measurement for this example because we were taking a measurement every hour. So all we have to do is say that the drop is equal to the infiltration rate. The first hour of the test, there was 2¼ inches of drop that occurred over 1 hour. So our infiltration rate for that first hour is 2¼ inches per hour. As you can see, because the drop lessened from hour to hour, the infiltration rate lessens as well too. 2¼ inches for the first hour of the test, 1¼ inches per hour infiltration rate for the second quarter, until we get down to those last 2 hours, hour 4 and 5 of the test, where the infiltration rate stayed steady at 3/4 inch per hour. The next thing we have to find is the most important data point, which is the final rate. This is basically the rate, the infiltration rate that we assign to that soil and that will be used to design that rain garden, that dry well, that permeable pavement, whatever it is. How do we find the final rate? Well, ideally what we want to see in our infiltration rate data is the formation of a steady state rate. What is a steady state rate? That's just some portion of the test, usually at the very, very end, almost always at the very end, where the drop, the infiltration rate stays consistent, stays steady from 1 hour to the next. And you can see in this example, we do find a steady state rate. The last 2 hours of the test, the infiltration rate remains steady at 3/4 inch per hour. If we find that steady state rate towards the end of the test, we will set the final rate equal to the steady state infiltration rate. So in this case, our final rate is assigned as 3/4 inch per hour. Now, every now and then, what we'll find is that we don't see a steady state rate. So to take this specific example, let's say in hour 5, instead of a measurement of 10 inches, our homeowner measured 9¾ inch, which means for that last 5th hour of the test, the drop was not 3/4 inch, it was just a 1/2 inch, which also means, since it was a measurement taken over an hour's increment, the infiltration rate for that final hour was also 1/2 inch per hour. Now you can see we don't have a steady state anymore. The infiltration rate continues to drop throughout the duration of the test. And if you see something like this, where the test rates do not steady out towards the end, what we do in this case is we look for our slowest rate, which is almost always the last hour of the test. Our slowest rate in this case was 1/2 inch per hour. So for this instance, we would set our final rate as that slowest hourly rate, or 1/2 inch per hour. How do you conduct an infiltration test? Well, you dig a hole. You dig a hole with a shovel or a post hole digger to the prescribed depth. For rain gardens and porous paving, that's 12 to 18 inches of depth. For dry wells, infiltration trenches, and bioretention facilities, the hole should be 24 to 36 inches of depth. Once the hole is dug, you pre-soak it, meaning you fill it up with water. You sit and wait until that water has completely drained out. This saturates the soil at your test site, and you want saturated soil before you take your actual infiltration test measurements. Next step is to do the actual test itself. You refill the hole, and then over the next 5 hours, you measure how quickly each and every hour that water level drops, how far that water level drops per hour over that 5-hour period. And again, it's generally the homeowner or the property owner that takes these readings. But sometimes the homeowner or property owner will ask for their contractor's help in prepping the site, digging the hole for them so that they can take those readings. The Conservation Assistance Program does have a standard test procedure for setting up the infiltration test and taking the measurements. You can find those standard procedures at the URL here, www.fairfaxcounty.gov/soil water-conservation/cap-contractor. On that web page, we have both written instructions, which you can see right here, and an instructional video, which will walk you step by step through the infiltration test procedures.
So now you've got results. You've got infiltration rates. You've got an analysis of the soil to see if there's any obvious problems like shallow bedrock, shallow water table. What do these results mean? Well, we do have design standards for VCAP that apply to all of the infiltration practices, rain gardens, dry wells, etc. So for all VCAP funded infiltration practices, we require that there be at least a 2-foot separation from the bottom of that rain garden, dry well, trench, porous paving to the top of the bedrock or groundwater. So you have to have 2 feet of good dry soil between the bottom of your infiltration facility and the top of the bedrock or groundwater.
For your infiltration results, if you are designing and installing a dry well or an infiltration trench, you need an infiltration rate of at least 0.5 inches per hour. Now there is a little bit of wiggle room on this standard if you're installing an infiltration trench, because if you're below 0.5 inches per hour, just slightly below 0.5 inches per hour, you can still install an infiltration trench as long as you also have an underdrain installed. An underdrain is sort of a perforated overflow drain pipe that is installed either in the center or in the bottom of the infiltration trench that will allow excess water to drain out during a big storm when that trench is completely filled. So slightly below 0.5 inches per hour is still all right for an infiltration trench, but below that level you are required to install an underdrain. For your dry well, 0.5 inches per hour is a hard and fast rule. If your infiltration rate is below 0.5 inches per hour, you cannot put in a dry well because dry wells are not allowed to have underdrains in them. If you are thinking of installing porous paving or a bioretention, and a bioretention again is just one of those big, fancier, more formally designed rain gardens, you have to install an underdrain if the infiltration rate is below 0.5 inches per hour. So unlike the dry well, you can put in porous paving or bioretention in soil that has infiltration rates below 0.5 inches per hour, but below that rate you are required to put in that perforated underdrain. If the rate is significantly below 0.5 inches per hour, you do have to use your professional judgment to determine if this really is a suitable site. Certainly for porous paving, I'd say you can go a little bit lower if you have really slowly permeable soils. Porous paving may still be a pretty good option for those really slowly permeable soils. But for a bioretention, you have to consider, if you're dropping down to 0.2, 0.1 inches per hour for your infiltration rate, is this really a good spot for a bioretention? There's no hard and fast rule to guide you. It's more just a matter of using your best judgment. Is this a project you would have confidence in? For your rain gardens, which is probably next to dry wells, rain gardens and dry wells are probably our most commonly installed infiltration practices through the VCAP program. If your infiltration rate is greater than 0.5 inches per hour, the only thing you are required to do at a minimum is mix in or amend compost into the natural soil. So basically you dig out the ponding depth at the top of your rain garden, you have the natural soil below that, you till in, mix in compost to that natural soil to make it a little bit more permeable. And that's if the infiltration rate is greater than 0.5 inches per hour. If your infiltration rate is between 0.5 and 0.25 inches per hour, for a rain garden at that point, you do then need to excavate out the natural soil, the native soil that's in place, and replace it with engineered rain garden soil media, the commercially available rain garden soil media that you can buy from quarry companies or some of the larger nurseries around here. That stuff is very, very sandy. It generally has a very, very high infiltration rate, and you will need, again, that engineered soil media as a requirement for any rain garden site that has an infiltration rate between 0.5 and 0.25 inches per hour. If you're getting infiltration rates that are really low, less than 0.25 inches per hour, you will need engineered soil media and and under drain. Both of those are requirements for those really slowly permeable soils. Or again, at this point, use your best professional judgment and consider if this really is a good location for a rain garden. If you're getting 0.1, 0.2 inches per hour, is that a site where you really should be putting a rain garden? Perhaps the answer is yes, but certainly ask yourself that. I mentioned these requirements. These are the minimum requirements. So for instance, if you have a site where the infiltration rate is above 0.5 inches per hour, you are required to put in compost amendments at a minimum. But if you want to go beyond those requirements, you can. If you wanted to excavate that soil and replace it with the engineered soil media, certainly you can do that, but you're not required to do that. What's shown on this slide are the requirements that kick in at each of these different infiltration rate ranges for the rain garden. And lastly, we have the dry swale. You may not be familiar with this one. It's not a project that has been too common through VCAP. We've seen a couple installed in the last year or so, and their popularity seems to be increasing. So it may be something that you see in the future, or maybe something that one of your clients mentions to you in the future. A dry swale is basically a long linear rain garden that is meant to both soak up rainwater but also convey stormwater from one point to the next, and it often has a few check dams along its length to help pool stormwater and allow it to soak down into the ground. If you're considering a dry swale and your infiltration rate is greater than 0.5 inches per hour, the only thing you're required to do to the soil at that point is to mix in compost amendments. So take the natural soil, till in compost to make it a little bit more porous. That's your only requirement at that point. If your infiltration rates are less than 0.5 inches per hour, then a dry swale requires engineered soil media and an underdrain. So you'll have to excavate and remove the natural soil, bring in that sandy engineered rain garden soil mix that you buy from a local supplier, and put an underdrain down towards the bottom of the practice as well, to a perforated underdrain. And again, if the infiltration rate is significantly below 0.5 inches per hour, 0.1, 0.2 inches per hour, something like that, you do have to consider whether this is the right location soil-wise for that dry swale. Whether it's a dry swale or any of the other infiltration practices that I mentioned previously, a continuing theme is always rely on your good professional judgment. So I've given you sort of the basic minimum requirements for designing and installing these practices in soils of differing infiltration rates. But if the site is making you nervous, if the infiltration rate is so low that you just don't have confidence that a rain garden, a dry well, a dry swale, an infiltration trench would work well in this site, if some red flags are raised, then by all means, bring that up with your client that you don't think this is a suitable soil for what they are trying to install. And remember, the VCAP applicant, the homeowner, is responsible for maintaining this project over 10 years. So you really do want to put projects into the ground that will be easy for a non-technical homeowner to maintain over a decade. So always rely on your good professional judgment when you're dealing with some of those really slowly permeable soils. For my last slide, I just wanted to put up again some of those important links to information that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. The links to the Fairfax County digital soil maps, as well as the instructions for running an infiltration test, can be found at the VCAP program page, and the URL is shown just below. I should also mention that all of the infiltration test minimums and the design specs that kick into place as a result of those minimums, that's also summarized on the infiltration test instruction PDF. So if you can't remember whether you have to put in an underdrain or not because you have a 0.6 inch per hour infiltration rate on your potential rain garden site, again, that information is included with the infiltration test instructions all in one PDF. If you are working in the city of Fairfax, the city of Alexandria, or really any other jurisdiction outside of Fairfax County, the link to soil maps for just about every jurisdiction in the United States can be found at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Web Soil Survey, and the URL for that is shown down there at the bottom of the slide. And finally, if you happen to be out at a client's property and there's something about the soil there that is just puzzling you or you can't quite figure out, by all means, feel free to contact me and I will do my best to help. My email is there, dan.schwartz@fairfaxcounty.gov, and my desk number is 703-324-1422. So feel free to send those difficult soil questions my way, and I'll do my best to answer them.
In this final part of the webinar, we're going to discuss some of the VCAP practices, what their requirements are for the program, and what information you need to provide to your client so they can have a complete application. All of this information is also found in the Landscape Professional's Guide to VCAP, which can be found on our website. So before we get started, let's talk about what a BMP is. A best management practice is a method of managing stormwater that reduces runoff volume and pollutant levels in our streams, rivers, and the Chesapeake Bay. States in the Chesapeake Bay watershed have to meet total maximum daily load goals, and BMPs are one way to do that. There are construction specifications for the BMPs, which are described in the VCAP design manual, and additional information can be found in the Virginia Stormwater Management Handbook, which is published by the Department of Environmental Quality. There are 12 BMP types that are eligible for cost share through the Conservation Assistance Program. We're going to go over 6 of these in more detail, as these are the most common practices installed through the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation Districts Program. More information about the requirements for the other 6 can be found in the VCAP design manual. There are also some training videos available for each practice type on the Virginia Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts website. In these practice overviews, you will see the term pretreatment mentioned several times. Pretreatment is a necessary component of many of the stormwater BMPs. Pretreatment techniques protect a BMP from the buildup of trash and sediment and dissipate the energy of the water as it enters the practice. If a particular stormwater BMP is sensitive to buildup of fine sediments, or if the drainage area will produce a lot of sediment, then pretreatment will be required. There are 3 types of pretreatment: dissipators, settling devices, and screens or filters. Settling devices and dissipators are usually installed at the point where the runoff enters the BMP, while screens and filters are located on downspouts. The diagram on the right shows some examples of the downspout devices. The first practice we're going to look at is permeable pavement. This practice is meant to help manage runoff by removing an impervious surface and replacing it with a pervious one. It can also be designed to capture additional impervious runoff from a nearby roof downspout by providing additional storage depth in the reservoir. There are a few options of pavement that can be used, so the most common we see in the program is permeable interlocking concrete pavers, which are shown in the photo at the bottom. This permeable pavement driveway replaced an asphalt driveway that was shedding runoff toward the street and into a nearby storm drain, which then carried runoff to a stream behind the property. Permeable asphalt, porous concrete, and grass or gravel-filled grids are also options. As you can see from the cross-section diagram, there is a gravel reservoir beneath the pavement surface. This is storage area that captures stormwater and allows it to soak into the surrounding soil and is a required component regardless of the surface product. Storage reservoir depth will be determined in part by the volume of runoff captured in a 1-inch storm and also by the manufacturer's specifications for the product. For example, in a 1-inch storm, if you calculate the required storage depth being 4 inches, but the manufacturer requires 6 inches of reservoir for stability reasons, you have to go with 6 inches. Or the other way around, the manufacturer requires 6 inches, but you calculate 8 inches needed for capturing the 1-inch storm, you have to go with the 8-inch depth. This cross-section is an example of what needs to be provided with the design plan for the application, and be sure to label it with the actual depth of each gravel layer. The application requirements were covered in more detail in the first video and are on the submission checklist provided to each applicant, but I'll go over each of these very quickly. The first one is a cross-section diagram with dimensions that we just saw earlier. For the infiltration test, we do need to see the individual timed measurements, not just that final number. Most of the time, the property owner is doing this test, but if you are performing it for them, please be sure to provide us that data. The design plan with the dimensions and area of the BMP. That area is an important one, often left off. We do need to have that. Permits, the construction sequence and timing. A soil stabilization plan, especially important if you're going to have soil that is not covered for more than just a few days. Sizing calculations with the contributing drainage area map showing pervious and impervious area being treated. For this one, you can use an aerial map and outline the contributing drainage areas, in other words, the roof or the driveway, and any pervious area that will be draining to it. We'll need that materials list, an itemized cost estimate, and a maintenance plan. On the right side are those eligible costs that can be included. Rainwater harvesting is another practice for reducing impervious surface runoff. VCAP requires that at least 250 gallons of runoff is captured, but this can be divided among multiple downspouts. It does not have to be one large tank like you see in these photos. This is a 250 gallon tank or cistern in these photos. However, the tank must be sized to capture the runoff generated in a 1-inch storm based on the roof area that drains to the downspout that feeds into the tank. You must capture at least that amount. So if, for example, 375 gallons of runoff is produced, you must install a tank that size or larger. This means that you might have to oversize the tank, but you cannot undersize it. The diagram on the left shows an example setup. This is a great example of a cross-section of what we would want to see in the application. Also note that pretreatment is a very important part of the installation to keep debris out of the system. Here we have the application requirements for rainwater harvesting, which is pretty similar for all the practices. That includes the design plan, the cost estimate, the size and calculations. For the eligible costs, of course, we have the cistern, the cost of installation, and also pumps have been added to the list of eligible costs. Now, the reimbursement rate for rainwater harvesting is a flat dollar amount per gallon rather than the percentage like many of the other practices. The most commonly installed practice in the Northern Virginia Conservation Assistance Programs is conservation landscaping. It does not have to meet any minimum infiltration rate, but it should be designed to help soak in runoff, therefore reducing the volume of water and the amount of pollutants that make it into the stormwater conveyance system and into nearby streams. It is most often installed in locations where there is poor vegetative cover, or it can be used to replace compacted turf where there is excess runoff. It is not meant for replanting existing plant beds, even if they are non-native. There are 5 subtypes of conservation landscaping. A meadow is in an open space and is free of woody plants. Meadows over 1,000 square feet in size are preferred to be established by seed unless plugs are required for the success of the installation. Tree planting should be done with bare root seedlings. Tree protection measures are required to keep them safe from deer browsing or being accidentally mowed down, and planting a diversity of species is recommended. A mixed planting bed is the most common type. It does not look like the typical landscape bed of a few shrubs surrounded by mulch. VCAP requires a minimum planting density of 75%. That is based on mature plant spread, not the size at the time of planting. A light layer of mulch should be used to protect soil until plants fill in, with the expectation that those plants will entirely fill the space in about 3 years. Another design feature to keep in mind is that it needs to be designed to soak in water, so the bed should be slightly lower than the surrounding area. Mulch should not be mounded up, as that will cause it to shed runoff. The next one, filter strips, intercept impervious sheet runoff and have a minimum required length and width, which will vary based on the slope of the area. It can be planted either as a meadow or a mixed bed. And last, riparian buffers are meadows, tree plantings, or mixed planting beds established along a stream or a pond edge. More criteria for all of these can be found in the VCAP manual. The application requirements for conservation landscaping are a little simpler than the other practices. For example, there's no sizing calculation for stormwater capture and no cross-section diagram needed. The eligible costs are for components that are necessary for the function and success of the project. So anything that is decorative cannot be cost shared. A lot of times this includes things like stepping stones and boulders. They can be used in the design, but they're generally not a reimbursable expense. So if they're going to be part of the cost, they should be itemized, both the material and the labor, so staff can remove those costs for consideration if needed. A rain garden is another popular practice in CAP. A rain garden can be used to manage excess runoff or to help with erosion by providing a place for concentrated runoff to pool and soak in. The soil should have a suitable infiltration rate of at least a ½ inch per hour, though an otherwise suitable location may get away with a slightly lower rate if an engineered soil media is used or perhaps an underdrain is installed. In CAP, a rain garden should receive impervious runoff. It can be piped in directly or guided on the surface for a maximum distance of 40 feet from the source of the runoff. In this first photo, roof water is piped in directly, but there was some expected pervious runoff, so a rock pretreatment was added. This next photo also has the runoff piped directly into the practice, though it's cleverly hidden behind the shrubs. And in this last photo, you can see the stone at the inflow points from the 2 downspouts as well as the 2 overflow points, protecting them from scouring. Here we have an example of a cross-section diagram for a rain garden that would be included in an application. We need to see inflow and overflow points, and whether you use a template like this one or draw your own, the cross-section must be labeled with the proposed depths for each layer. Also note that the bottom of the rain garden basin, where the mulch is in the diagram, is flat. It is not a bowl or sloped. The ponded water should be distributed evenly. If you are using our rain garden sizing spreadsheet, the calculated surface area refers to this flat bottom area. You will also notice in this diagram above the mulch layer that the side walls are sloped out, so the actual surface area of the rain garden will be larger than the bottom of the basin. Just like with the other practices, we have application requirements, the design drawing with the area, your cross-section, infiltration test results, sizing calculations, your cost estimate, materials list, and your plant list, of course, of only Virginia native plants. A dry well would be installed to treat the same types of resource concerns as a rain garden, excess runoff and/or erosion, but it provides subsurface storage and is a good option for properties that don't have enough space for a rain garden or for property owners who maybe are not so comfortable with plant maintenance. On the right is a photo of a dry well during installation. You can see the downspout inflow points, the observation well, and overflow, and in this case the storage area consisted of prefabricated tanks which are surrounded by gravel. The storage area can be just gravel if preferred, which will require it to be larger overall size due to having less void space than a tank or a chamber. The cross-section on the left is a sample. Again, we need to see where those downspouts are entering the dry well, the depths of the layers. If you have a storage tank in there, show that in there. And of course, that ever important pre-treatment area. Application requirements for the dry well are similar to those that we've looked at already. The eligible cost may include the excavation of the area, the gravel or stone used to fill the space, a storage reservoir if you're using one, piping to bring that runoff into the dry well, geotextile fabric, pre-treatment devices, the delivery costs, and seed or sod that will go over the top of the dry well once it's installed. The last practice we're discussing is less common but highly impactful, and that is impervious surface removal. Like with permeable pavement, this practice reduces runoff by converting impervious surface to pervious. That impervious surface can be asphalt, can be concrete, another hard surface like a grouted stone patio, and it can even be compacted gravel, usually referring to something that's been in place for 3 years or longer. That surface gets removed and then gets planted. It can be planted with turf, plants, or conservation landscaping. The important thing is that it must be stabilized with a planted material. It can't just be left bare. Impervious surface removal is cost shared by the square foot, but all of the items below under eligible costs can be included in your cost estimate. One thing to note for impervious surface removal is that the cost share for that is already taken into account for permeable pavement. That's because permeable pavement is replacing an impermeable surface, therefore ISR is implied. So the cost shares don't get stacked. However, if the impervious surface is being replaced with conservation landscaping, that is native plants at that 75% density, the project can qualify for both cost shares for ISR and conservation landscaping in a single application. As you learned in the first video, there are 4 sizing spreadsheets available on our website that do the hard work of the calculations for you when it comes to determining the size of an infiltration practice. It is not a requirement that you use these, but if you choose not to, you will need to provide your calculations in the design plan. Let's have a look at the rain garden sizing spreadsheet. Let's start over here with our color key. The yellow cells are our data cells. That's where you're going to be putting in some numbers. The light blue are the calculation cells. That's where the spreadsheet is going to be putting in some numbers. And the dark blue are the constant values. They are already filled in. In this case, it is our 1-inch rainstorm. So let's start off at the top. This is our contributing drainage area. In other words, our impervious surface and our pervious surface that are contributing to the rain garden. Let's say we have 500 square feet of roof area that is going to the rain garden and there's no pervious area. We have our 1-inch storm and that gives us about 40 cubic feet of treatment volume. The next section we have here is for inputting our layers of the rain garden. The first one is the mulch depth. This doesn't actually affect the size of the rain garden, but if you want to put that number in, it'll help further down in the spreadsheet where it can help to calculate your materials. So let's just say we have 2 inches of mulch. And our ponding area is next. So that depth will affect the size of the rain garden. And usually we're looking at between 6 and 9 inches in depth. So let's start out with 6. We come down here to these light blue cells. Our storage depth is 6 inches and our surface area is just under 80 square feet. Again, that is for that bottom basin of the rain garden. That does not include the sloped out area. Again, the amended soil depth, if you have a good infiltration rate, that is what you're going to be putting in, but it does not affect the size of the rain garden. If you have a lower infiltration rate, you can add in the soil media depth and the gravel bed depth, and those will affect the size of the rain garden because they do have a little bit more space than your native soil would have. So just let's see how that looks. And that brings our sizing down quite a bit. Bringing those back to 0, just so we can see how the ponding area depth also affects the size of the rain garden. Let's say you didn't have this space to work with and you need to make your ponding area a bit deeper. If we change that to 9, that brings it all the way down to just under 53 square feet of surface area. Coming down here, just as we were talking about, this part of the spreadsheet can help calculate the materials needed. And if you wanted to put in your costs, that would also help calculate your costs. Over on the right side, again, we have these cross-section diagrams just like we saw earlier. This one actually puts in the depths for you. If we put back that 12 inches of amended soil, that would show back up over here. You could use that in the application, take a screenshot, just make sure that you are adding in the appropriate inflow and outflow points. When developing the design and cost estimate for a CAP project, keep in mind there are some things that are not eligible for cost share reimbursement. The items listed here are the most common components we see included in designs that are not eligible, but you can refer to the VCAP manual for complete lists of eligible components for each practice type, some of which we also saw on the previous slides. The first to dry creek beds. The program wants to see runoff soaking into the soil, and though a dry creek bed might help reduce the energy of runoff, they don't help the water soak into the soil. There are some situations where rock is appropriate, like in this photo here, such as protecting the outfall area of a downspout or a culvert, or for guiding downspout runoff into a rain garden. But in a conservation landscaping, a densely planted area of sturdy vegetation is preferred. Next is decorative features. These can be included in the design, but they cannot be cost shared. In most cases, boulders are going to be seen as decorative rather than functional, so these should either be removed from the cost estimate, or if you're unsure of whether it might qualify, it should be itemized in the cost estimate so staff can subtract the cost if necessary. The next item, terraces and retaining walls. The program seeks to fund the most cost-effective measures for addressing the resource concern on a property. Coir logs are an example of a low-cost way of creating a terrace that would be eligible for reimbursement, but terraces and stone walls or timber walls would not typically be covered. Again, they can be installed if they're preferred by the client, but they should be excluded from the cost estimate or itemized. Non-native plants. These, again, cannot be cost shared and should generally not be included in a CAP designated area. Some species that are commonly believed or accepted to be native, we often see included in plans, but they're not actually native according to the Atlas of the Flora of Virginia, which is the resource the program refers to when determining whether a plant is native. If you're on that website, it does include plants that are known to have wild populations in the state, both native and non-native, so be sure to open the link for species to view the full distribution map. Red dots mean that it is native, blue means it's introduced, and gray is uncertain. The program does allow some uncertain species to be included in a plan, but please check with staff to confirm. And also, a plant only needs to be native to somewhere in the state of Virginia. It does not have to be native at the county level. NVSWCD staff do verify each practice installation before submitting for cost share reimbursement. We can't see those underground components at the post-install inspection, so it is important that we confirm everything before it's covered up and too late to fix any issues. This can be done by photos over email, a video chat, or even in person. At that final inspection, after the installation is complete, we will be looking for several things. Does the installation align with the plan that was submitted? Are there any non-native plants? Is the practice functioning properly? If there is any major deviation from the approved plan, or if there are functionality issues, they will need to be addressed before reimbursement can be requested. Here we have a few common mistakes that are found at the design or installation phases of an application. The first two are at that design phase. They're pretty easily fixed, but keeping these in mind will reduce them back and forth as we review the application. The first is incorrect practice sizing. Infiltration practices and rainwater harvesting must treat the 1-inch rainstorm. We do have those sizing spreadsheets that are a useful tool, but there are also formulas available in the appendices of the VCAP design manual. So be sure to use those to get your correct sizing for those practices that need it. The infiltration test is something usually the applicant does on their own, but if you are conducting the test for them, we do need to see the actual recorded measurements for each hour the test is monitored. The next two are mistakes that we find at the inspection, and that's going to take a bit more time and effort to correct, so we hope to avoid these by talking about them a bit ahead of time. The first is plant substitutions. It happens frequently that a plant species becomes unavailable sometime between the point of application and the time of installation. Substitutions are perfectly okay, but we ask that either you or your client confirm your new selections with staff prior to installing them to confirm that they're native. If you are concerned about meeting the installation deadline, the applicant should reach out to NVSWCD staff to talk about extending their deadline. We'd rather see that than have accidental non-native plants go into a planting. And the last is mounded plant beds. Rainwater naturally finds its way to the lowest places in a landscape. So if a bed is mounded up, anything that falls on that plant bed is going to shed off to the sides, and any runoff flowing toward it is going to end up going around it. Instead, conservation landscapes in CAP projects should be slightly lower than the surrounding area so that water that falls on the landscape stays in, and runoff flowing toward it can move through it and soak in. There's one last topic I'd like to go over, which was already mentioned in the first video, but to be considered for funding, an application must achieve a minimum score. The score is calculated by adding points given for meeting objective criteria based on the impact the project would have on water quality. Most infiltration practices will meet the score without any difficulty. They capture a measurable amount of runoff. However, conservation landscaping may have some difficulty getting that minimum score. There are 4 site-related criteria that result in having a higher score. The first is the practice being within 100, or even better, within 40 feet of the stormwater conveyance system. That's the storm drain, the curb gutter, a stream. The next is treating a steep slope. A slope of 15% or more has a higher score, or mitigating impervious runoff to a slope of 15% or more also gets some extra points. Of the 3 VCAP resource concerns, erosion receives the most points and excess runoff receives the least, with poor vegetative cover being in the middle of the 2. Runoff that is untreated, and what we mean by that is runoff from the property, doesn't go into a stormwater facility such as a dry pond or bioretention, also gets additional points. The last one on the list is the only one the applicant and the designer can affect, and that is the cost effectiveness. The lower the cost per square foot of the installation, the more points an application receives. If a conservation landscaping practice you are designing does not get extra points from those first few criteria I just mentioned, this is where you may need to make some changes. A larger installation at a lower cost doesn't sound like it's going to be too easy to achieve, but there are a few things you can do. They may not be your standard way of doing things, but they can help reduce the costs. The first is smaller plant sizes. VCAP has that minimum density requirement of 75% plant coverage, so you do need a large quantity of plants, but they don't have to be big. Small specimens grow quickly and they fill in nicely. Another way to reduce costs is for the property owner or volunteers to help with the installation. Now, while we cannot calculate the actual score until we have a complete plan with a cost estimate, we do know the site conditions and can have some idea of how a project will score. If you or your client contact us during the planning phase, we should be able to give you some idea of the size and cost range needed to meet that minimum score. Thanks for taking the time to learn more about the Conservation Assistance Programs. That's the end of the webinar training on CAP for landscape professionals. Links to the resources mentioned in this video are in the YouTube video description. And if you have any questions, you can always reach us at conservationdistrict@fairfaxcounty.gov. Don't forget to take the quiz that is linked on our website so we can add you to our list of landscape professionals that we provide to all site visit recipients.